Hello, Stephanomics here, the podcast that brings you the global economy. This week focused on two very important elections, one coming up and the other just happened. The one that's happened, which will probably turn out to be more important for the planet, was the Brazilian presidential election, and the winner, as you'll definitely all know by now, was Luiz Inacio de Silva, universally known as Lula. He's already served 2 terms as president, up until 2010. He also served prison time barely 2 years ago for corruption and money laundering. Now, investors had been frightened when this left-wing populist was elected the first time around. Now they seem to be relieved. But what happens next? Maria Eloisa Caburo in Brasilia has an on-the-ground report in a few minutes. But first I thought we should talk about the US midterm elections on November 8th, which you'd think would be heavily influenced by what's happening in the US economy, but maybe not. Let's talk it all through with Bloomberg chief US economist Anna Wong and Bloomberg's White House reporter Nancy Cook. Now, Anna, we have every congressional seat and a third of the seats in the Senate up for grabs in this election. Before we get to how the economy has or has not changed the race in different parts of the country, I guess you should just paint a scene for us. Inflation is obviously the highest we've seen in many years in the US, but it's not a straightforward sort of economic crisis story. I mean, the US is not in recession. We're not seeing a big rise in unemployment. So how's the economy looking?
Well, first of all, people feel very gloomy about the future. But if you look at the fundamentals, such as the actual spending, how much people have in the bank accounts, jobs out there, the actual labor income growth over the past 12 months, it's actually better than many years, for decades. In fact, it's the best in a couple decades. And the reason why people feel gloomier than the fundamentals would predict they would feel is because of inflation. And research on people's psychology is not strong suit of economists, but sociologists and other fields have shown that people just feel like they're cheated whenever inflation is high, right? You even if your nominal income rise at the same pace as inflation, people just feel cheated when inflation is eroding their nominal income.
I guess we should just clarify, because there has been, I know Larry Summers has talked about how most people's real wages have been going down even though the nominal is high. So for a big chunk of the workforce, I guess wages are not quite keeping up with inflation, or you would say they are keeping up?
Well, I would say for the lower income household, we see that nominal income growth at the bottom quartile of workers are actually catching up with inflation. The wage growth was at 10 or 11% at the bottom 25% of the workers. So for those workers, I would say their real income is catching up to, actually has been positive over the past 12 months. But for the top half of the workers, I would say that the real wage has been declining over the past 12 months.
So, and Nancy, we heard from Anna, on paper, although we have this high inflation, we do have still an extremely low unemployment rate. Incomes have either been keeping up with inflation or almost keeping up with inflation. You've paid a lot of attention to these campaigns and how the White House has been dealing with them. How would you say, what's been more salient on the campaign trail? Inflation, jobs, or other things entirely, like the change in the abortion rules?
So we've seen lately in poll after poll, voters are really saying that the most dominant issue to them and the one that they plan to vote on is a combination of the economy and inflation. In the closing weeks of this campaign, inflation has really become the dominant issue. I would say over the summer, Democrats were very hopeful, actually, and they felt like their messages on abortion rights, threats to democracy, what they saw as extremism on the part of Republicans in terms of some of their policy proposals. Democrats really felt like that would help them potentially stave off much larger losses in the midterms. So, historically, the party in power always loses some seats in the midterms, but I think Democrats in July and August really felt much more optimistic. You've seen a real sea change starting in September, I would say, into October, where Democrats are starting to grow much more pessimistic. The economy has become the main issue. Gas prices have fluctuated, and that has definitely hurt people's perception of the economy. And another thing that we've seen is the housing market in the U.S. has started to cool as the Fed keeps raising interest rates. And so that is also affecting people. And the White House is aware that while some economists believe inflation has peaked, things like food prices and also the prices for, housing have remained high. And those are really what the majority of Americans spend their money on. And so even if you have, some wonky White House economist on TV saying, look, we think inflation has peaked, that doesn't necessarily mean that these key voters that the White House needs to win over, like women, suburban women, independents, that's a message that they're going to be receptive to if they're seeing high prices at the grocery store, fluctuating gas prices, and maybe let's say their rent has gone up a lot.
I do remember when various attempts earlier in the year by President Biden to talk about the Putin price hike and to blame President Putin for high inflation. That hasn't really stuck, right? I mean, have Republicans successfully been able to blame the Biden administration for high inflation?
The Republicans are trying to make this election a report card on President Biden and his leadership of the economy. What the White House has been trying to do is make this, particularly lately, into a choice between the two parties. And they're trying to say, look, we understand inflation is high, but we're doing all these things. We've released We've done a release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We passed this sweeping legislation in August that's meant to bring down inflation and control some prices, particularly for seniors on prescription drugs.
The Inflation Reduction Act.
Exactly.
Many people in other countries sounded a bit silly, but anyway, who are we to say?
Well, it was branded with the elections in mind. But what they're trying to say is look at the things we've done. We know that you're in pain, but with the high prices, but we've tried to do all these things and we're doing everything we can. And by the way, the White House says, inflation is really the purview of the Federal Reserve. And what they're trying to say is if Republicans control things again like Congress, they don't have a plan to cover inflation. Meanwhile, Republicans just keep sort of bringing up things that are happening every day, like the everyday costs. And they're really hammering the White House on this. And they have just had a great amount of success in recent weeks, sort of driving the inflation economy message home, combined with a renewed focus on crime. There's a lot of crime in American cities now. And I think that those are messages that are really speaking to voters.
During midterms, that you can have very different campaigns in different parts of the country for specific Senate seats or even specific congressional seats. So are geographical economic differences playing into different kinds of campaigns?
They certainly are. And you see also different candidates trying to tailor their message to different voting groups. So, for instance, Bloomberg Economics did this great thing called the Misery Index, which looks at where Americans are most miserable. And so what we've seen in the Midwest part of the country, the combination of sort of inflation and unemployment is not as bad. But in other places where there are key Senate races like Arizona and Nevada, the misery index is very high. And so, for instance, in Arizona, we've seen the Democratic candidate there, Mark Kelly, really try to tailor his message and steer clear of Biden. Biden has not gone anywhere near Arizona, and really try to tailor his message to the huge number of Latino voters that Democrats are trying to woo, who pollsters tell me have been very concerned about inflation. And so he is trying to talk to that group specifically. We've seen in Nevada, Democrats really trying to turn out to union forces. There's a bunch of the casino workers are unionized, so they're really trying to speak to those groups and appear friendly to labor and speak to those people about high prices. But again, President Biden has steered clear of Nevada too. So it's an interesting thing where the economy is being experienced differently in different states of the country, and each Senate race is sort of its own little microcosm of what is happening in the economy and what those themes are.
Well, Anna Wong, that's a good segue to you. I guess you should remind us what the misery index is. And I think also remind us of this discussion that we've had, I think, in the past about how you can... It could potentially be that higher inflation is more politically damaging than high unemployment because of the larger number of people it affects.
Yeah, so misery index is the sum of unemployment rate and the inflation rate. And whereas unemployment, as Stephanie said, unemployment affects only a small portion of the population, inflation is felt by every household. And in fact, in the lower income households who spend a higher share of their budget on gasoline and food, they feel it more. And to Nancy's point about the geographic distribution of this misery that's being felt differently in this country, we have found, based on misery index at the state level, that the red states' misery was higher and in fact worsened more under the Biden years than during the Trump years. And it is a very clear trend. And that could explain why red states the voters there are more passionate about going out to vote. And the reason why misery has worsened in red states more so than the blue states was because the red states never really locked down as hard as the blue states. So their local economy was already growing at sort of capacity before everybody opened up, right? Then after everybody opened up, and with the American Rescue Act, the inflation impulse further hit these red states more because they were operating at close to capacity even before. Hence, we see that red states has generally higher inflation than blue states.
You've been really ahead of the game, ahead of many other forecasters this year, not only in predicting where that Federal Reserve interest rate was going to go, way ahead of anyone else, expecting that to maybe get as high as 5%, but also expecting inflation to go higher for longer than many expected. So 2 years' time, general election, what do your forecasts say is the economy that President Biden potentially would be trying to get re-election on?
So our base case is for a recession to begin in the third quarter of 2023. So by November 2024, I would predict the economy would be gradually improving. But given that my forecast is also for the Fed to only begin to cut rates in 2024, perhaps around springtime of 2024, the economy would only be in the nascent stage of turning around. Unemployment would be at 5% at that point. It will be pretty bad for Biden's election campaign.
So Nancy, we have now kind of started to look into the future. So tell us what's your best guess of the election outcome, the midterm election outcome, and briefly what that might mean for US economic policy making over the next couple of years.
So I've talked to a bunch of pollsters and Democratic strategists this week, and there is sort of a wide consensus that Democrats will lose the House. It's just a matter of by how wide of a margin. A lot of people think that the Democrats, the Senate is a little bit more unclear, but I think that if they have divided government, even if Republicans just control the House, it means that there will be very little economic policy making within the Biden White House. There won't be any big legislative sweeping packages. And what typically happens in year 3 and 4 of a presidency, if there's divided government, is that the economic policy making is really relegated to just regulatory stuff. So things done out of agencies, rules being rewritten. The president will turn much more to foreign policy, and perhaps there'll be some things done on some international economic issues. He can continue to talk about the CHIPS Act. Maybe they will do something on trade, although they've been very reluctant to do anything on the Chinese tariffs. But those will really be the areas that I will be looking for. I don't think there will be much happening out of the White House on the domestic economic front.
We don't know whether it will be good news for Americans, but it's bad news for people covering US economic policy. Nancy Cook and Anna Wong, thank you so much. Now, even by US standards, the battle for the Brazilian presidency was brutal, almost certainly the toughest contest in Brazil's 40-odd years of democracy. And the margin of victory was small, just under 2 percentage points. But 2% of the vote in Brazil equates to 2 million extra votes cast for Lula. And despite some complaints about fraud in the electoral system and demonstrations on the streets by supporters of the now outgoing president, Jair Bolsonaro, it looks like 2 million votes is going to be enough to secure a peaceful transfer of power. But what kind of economy does President-elect Lula inherit? Does he have the team, the resources, to deliver on his promises. Here's Maria Eloisa Caporo in Brasilia.
Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva. Lula, as Brazilians know him, is returning to the presidency after 2 prior terms in office in the early 2000s. The intervening years have been colorful, to say the least. He spent more than a year in jail for accusations of his involvement in a corruption scheme known as car wash. And his presidential campaign was tighter than expected, with supporters of incumbent Jair Bolsonaro a majority in Congress. But Lula has promised better times ahead, and his supporters are hopeful he'll deliver. Here's some of them singing one of the most famous campaign slogans just after Lula was declared president, with 50.9% of the votes. The next 4 years aren't short of challenges. Latin America's largest economy will face lower growth, high interest rates, and persistent inflation. Here's Ernesto Revilla, head Latin American economist at Citigroup.
It's never good news when the Fed hikes rates for emerging markets, so Brazil will be facing headwinds going into next year with lower commodity prices, tighter financial conditions, and slower global growth in China, in Europe, and in the US. We're forecasting relatively low growth for all of Latin America, but in particular for Brazil in 2023.
This is Gabriela, a self-declared Bolsonaro supporter I talked to at a coffee shop in Brasília prior to election day.
O que eu mais levo em consideração, inclusive, é a economia.
The economy is one of the things that I think about the most when I cast my vote. I'm an independent worker, and I need the economy to perform well. Only now, after the pandemic, we are seeing that there's an economic bounce back, and I fear that things will change and the economy could stall.
And here, Euraiji, who was working at a clothing store in the southwest neighborhood of Brasília the day prior to elections.
Politics are an embarrassment this year, really. I never seen anything like this. And this impacts businesses. I'm really worried about unemployment and security. There's a lot of people going hungry and without jobs.
Interest rates in Brazil are at the highest since 2017. Central bankers were ahead of the curve and raised interest rates in the wake of the pandemic. Last September, they stopped an 18-month-long tightening cycle, which took rates to 13.75%. Inflation fell from 12% earlier this year to a forecast of 5.6% by December. But it wasn't monetary policy that helped halt price increases. It was tax cuts. Temporary tax cuts that lowered transportation costs, including gasoline. And most of them are set to expire by the end of the year. Here's Roberto Sesamski, Brazil analyst at Barclays.
So we have seen a significant decline in headline inflation. In fact, we experienced 3 months of deflation in Brazil between July and September. But now in October, we already started to see monthly prices rising again. So when you look at what we call core inflation, that basically focus on the less volatile prices in the economy, that measure continues to be quite high, and it will take longer for them to improve.
Brazil's economy has proven resilient to high interest rates. Many Brazilians are concerned of what comes next for the economy. Sesamski, the Barclays analyst, expects the nation's economy to grow by just 1% next year, down from 2.7%. And a big question is how the government will respond to persisting inflation. Here's Fábio Mendes, a doorman in the southwest neighborhood of Brasília.
Em relação à economia, que Deus abençoe.
May God bless whoever wins, because the economy is really weak. It's not performing as it should. I worry about the prices of food, gasoline, and cooking gas. We'll see what the next president does, and if he manages to lower prices, because if not, we won't even have enough to eat.
And then, there's all the campaign promises that need funding.
Nós vamos aumentar o salário mínimo. Ele será corrigido todo ano.
That's Lula, in an event in the city of Juiz de Fora, speaking to a crowd of supporters before Election Day. He's promising to raise minimum wages so they match inflation. During the campaign trail, he also promised to cut taxes for those with the lowest income. He promised a tax reform that would increase taxes on the richest. And he promised paychecks to the poor of 600 reais, which is about 116 US dollars. But the now elected president hasn't said how all of that will be financed.
Brazil's public debt has risen through most of the past decade and is now the highest among the major emerging markets. What investors need from the government is some sort of reassurance that this debt will be paid back at some point.
Here's Adriana Dupita, Brazil economist at Bloomberg Economics.
The big problem for Brazil right now is that none of its fiscal rules is credible. Governments from the right and the left political spectrum have circumvented each of these rules. So the first question for the new presidential mandate is to propose a new, credible, enforceable, and feasible fiscal rule. The second question is to make sure that the country can fund the many promises made on the campaign trail, especially on social aid and income tax cuts.
Latin America has seen a wave of protests erupt as governments have failed to deliver their promises of helping ease the pain of high inflation and low growth. So it's not just the market, but Brazilians themselves, who will be looking at how Lula navigates the challenge of increasing social aid while keeping Brazil's debt levels stable. And they are likely to keep tabs on their new president, who could come under pressure if he doesn't fulfill all those promises he made on the campaign trail. For Bloomberg News, this is Maria Loisa Capurro.
So I'm delighted to talk a bit more about the prospects for Brazil with Richard Back, who's head of political analysis and strategy at XP Investimentos in Brazil. But I should say he's joining me from a mountaintop in what is a public holiday in Brazil. So thank you very much for having this conversation with me on your day off, Richard. It's been a busy week, I know, and we've had quite a lot of uncertainty at various times over whether the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, had actually admitted defeat. So I guess, could you just give us an update on where things stand?
Sure. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to talk to you today. Lula is getting some kind of short vacations from today until Sunday. So I'm really happy with this. So I could come to this mountain and take a breath for a couple of days, and then we'll be back.
Yeah, he's on the beach, I was told.
In Bahia State,
on the beach.
Yes. Yeah. This is a very nice place. I recommend. And we are living these days after the elections that Bolsonaro have recognized the result of the election, but we're seeing this road being blocked by Bolsonaristic truck drivers and militants from his cause. And I think it works in a coordinated way, because Bolsonaro was delaying to make a first speech after the elections, because he was hoping that people will go to the streets and make protests in favor of him, and then he could be politically stronger than he is right now. But the other side of this coin is if people doesn't go, and they are not going in this multitudes that he was hoping, he will be in a weak situation and very isolated by the establishment in Brazil, media, political establishment, judiciary establishments. They are just leaving Bolsonaro. So I don't think this will work in a good way for him, but I think it's done. What I'm saying to our clients since the last month, I think since September, is we were forecasting this. Truck drivers, people in the streets protesting, but we never took this as a real threat to democracy in Brazil. So this is a thing that democracy can support. I'm not saying they should support, but can support, and it is happening. But I think the end is 1 week, 2 weeks. We are free from this thing.
Yeah, so you can have demonstrations on the street, but that doesn't necessarily mean a real challenge to the rule of law or to the peaceful transfer of power. And just to remind us, when would that transfer of power happen? When would President-elect, I guess, Lula become president again?
Yeah, again, third time. There's two moments. One moment in December, maybe December the 10th. It is a date that Supreme Electoral Court defines in December, when they give him a kind of certificate that he won the elections. So, and then this first moment, official, and the second moment is January the 1st, when you have officially the new president. It is constitutional. You have officially the new president becoming president, working in the office officially. And the Congress in Brazil, 1 month after that, is February the 1st.
What kind of constraints do you see on him? And of course, there's a lot of people hoping that he can achieve great things and be focusing on the poorest in society and other things that he's been sort of known for. Is he going to be very constrained in what he can do?
Yes, he will. I think he will have the same constraints that Bolsonaro faced in the last 4 years in this more ideological agenda in terms of behavior, especially. Bolsonaro couldn't approve a lot of things in the right-wing side, and Lula would not approve a lot of things from the left-wing side agenda. I think he will have a majority in Congress, like 270 congressmen in the House, like 40 congressmen, senators in Senate. It is very, very, very easy to see the numbers in favor of Lula. Not a big majority, but majority in both houses. But it doesn't mean he will do anything he wants. It cannot be his own party administration. He knows that he will have to bring more people and will have to deal with the Congress and the judiciary, because this is a mess, the situation that judiciary is in Brazil today. So he's saying, and this is positive, that he knows that he cannot be radical or revengeful against the institutions, because he can be removed from the presidency, as Dilma was in the past. He nominated Alckmin, his vice president, a very conservative man, for the coordination of the process of transition, which is a very good sign, because he could nominate someone from his own party. So he is opening this thing a little bit, because it doesn't mean much, but he knows and he reads Lula very well, those kind of signals that he has to give to the society. So he's doing that.
From a distance, it looks surprising, when Lula was first elected, and he's this left-wing firebrand, former trade unionist and metal worker. I seem to remember investors in the financial markets were pretty worried. And yet this result of his winning the presidency seems to have gone down reasonably well. So briefly, how would you describe the reaction of kind of international investors to this result, and what is it that investors are thinking when they look at Lula?
Yeah, it was interesting, because since the last year, after the general opening, and finally we could travel to the US and UK and make contacts with personally with our clients and investors in Brazil, and they were more comfortable with Lula winning the elections before the Brazilians. So the foreigners, they were more comfortable with this thing. Yeah, we know Lula, he will make distortions, but he's not the guy that will blow everything and make a very red government, red administration, left-wing orientated. during the campaign. We haven't this volatility that many people were expecting during the elections, in the markets in Brazil, because the investors in Brazil, they used to say, we already know the good part and the best part of both of these guys, Lula and Bolsonaro. So we have seen the worst from Lula and the best from Lula, the worst from Bolsonaro, the good parts of Bolsonaro. So not that surprising situation, right?
That's interesting. And finally, for the region and for the sort of broader economy, do you think it's good news to have Lula re-elected? We are in a very difficult situation for the global economy. Lots of emerging market economies dealing with a stronger dollar, which traditionally is quite a bad thing, and also rising interest rates by the Federal Reserve. We've been talking earlier in the show about the US interest rate. That's in the past often been a recipe for crises in places like Brazil. But we also have some possible pluses and advantages coming to South America from the fact that the US is sort of distancing itself and potentially decoupling from some of its trade relationships with China. So does a Lula presidency make it more likely that Brazil will come through this in relatively good health and maybe seize some opportunities from the current state of affairs?
I think so. The diagnosis that his party and people in his inner circle is getting more matured, because it was scaring me personally, because 6 months ago when you asked them about the foreign situation, the Fed, all that stuff, it wasn't in their political or economical calculations, and it was kind of surprise for them. So at this point I was looking and wow, this is weird, they should be aware about that, but they are increasing this understanding that the foreign situation can be not good for Brazil. So but Lula, he's already doing better in this foreign relationship than Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro he's not very fond of this international negotiations, and Lula he loves that thing, he loves to be loved. So he and Macron, they have a very good relationship. I'm pretty sure that he will meet with Mr. Joe Biden before even being in the office. In terms of negotiation, I think Lula has advantage in terms of reading the scenario and acting according to the scenario. I think Bolsonaro has a better team than Lula can nominate.
That's interesting. So right now, the sort of economic expertise would still favour the current president, but if what your standing in the international community means anything at all, President Lula is going to be better off, as not least because he's going to go off and be the hero at the COP meetings I see in Egypt. So many concerns globally about what was going to happen to the Brazilian the rainforest if President Bolsonaro stayed in power. Richard Bach, thank you so much for doing this on your day off. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
That's it for Stephanomics. I have no idea what we're going to talk about next week, but check out the Bloomberg News website for more economic news and views on the global economy, and follow @economics on Twitter. This episode was produced by Sama Sadi, Yang and Magnus Henriksson, with special thanks to Eloisa Maria Capurro, Richard Bach, Nancy Cook and Anna Wong. Mike Sasso is the executive producer of Stephanomics.